This is Mike Edwards, and welcome to the AssetOptics Quick Start Learning Series. In today's session, we are going to learn about the Inventory Management Data Model as well as how to perform inventory transactions. As we look at the AssetOptics Inventory Data Model, there are several objects that we utilize for inventory management: products, storerooms, accounts, parts, part bin locations, part transactions, work order parts. So the first of which is the product object. Think of the product as the catalog master. This is the standard Salesforce product catalog. If you want to use bills of materials, or if you'd like to set up multi-site inventory management, then you must set up the product catalog. If you're not going to do either multi-site inventory or bills of materials, service bills that is, then you can just actually skip the product and just go directly to setting up parts. The next object is the storeroom. A storeroom is essentially a warehouse, and that defines the shipping location, where the storeroom is. There are several default attributes on a storeroom that are important, and most specifically things like the default buyer for that storeroom as well as the general ledger accounts. Next, there is a service part, and the service part is the stock item record. This is the record where you will establish your minimum stocking quantities for a particular item at a storeroom. So you set your minimum stocking quantities. This is where you manage your on-hand inventory quantities, who you buy this from, and this is the object from which you actually perform inventory transactions. Now, hanging off of the part object is something called part bin locations. Part bin locations are the individual bins where you keep and manage inventory inside of the storeroom. There are 5 segments that are set up by default, and those segments are row, section, level, bin, and divider. Kind of wrapping up from the object perspective, we also have the account object, which is the standard Salesforce account object. The accounts are used for vendors to support the purchasing process, and accounts are also used as manufacturers to represent who are the particular part manufacturers. Lastly, we have the work order part. The work order part is the linkage and the relationship between parts and work orders. So this represents what parts are used on which work orders. It's at the work order part level where we define what's the planned quantity, and as we issue that part to that work order, the issue transactions accumulate on that work order part record so that we have an issued quantity. The net difference between those represents the open quantity, and when we have open quantity of a part on a work order and the work order is in an open status, then there's demand placed on inventory for that particular part. Lastly, of the objects that we'll discuss are part transactions. The part transactions are essentially all of the inventory adjustments, all the inventory moves. There are 5 unique transaction types. There's a gain adjustment, a shrink adjustment, an issue adjustment, and then there are 2 other system generated transaction types, and those are orders and receipts. Those get directly entered from PO line items, and it's something to note that all the transactions are processed against the primary bin location unless you specify a secondary bin location. Another key thing to note is that when you receive stock item inventory off of a purchase order, it is received into the primary bin location and only the primary bin location. If you need to move it to store it into a secondary bin location, then you do have to perform a bin location move. Okay, so when you enter an inventory transaction, really the only required value is that you enter the transaction quantity. The default inventory transaction type is an issue. If you click on the drop down pick list, you'll be able to select gain or shrink adjustment. And if you perform an issue, there's a validation rule that would require that you put in a work order number. So let's actually kind of navigate through a little bit more so that you can see some of these in action. So I'm going to click on the Service Parts tab right here, and then we're just going to go and we're going to grab this particular part record, this 5VX750 belt. I click on this, so we can see that this 5VX750 belt is stored in storeroom number 1. Now, there are many different attributes that are tracked, but of course, let's just point out a few of these key things here. We have an on-hand quantity, we have a work order open commit quantity. Of course, this is driven from the work order part record and defines how many of that particular part are being called for on work orders. So if you take that commit quantity and subtract that from the on-hand quantity, that gives us our available quantity or our free stock. We see that we have we only have 11 available, and we have a minimum stocking quantity of 61 that's set. So we're far below what our minimum stocking quantity is. If we expand here under ordering information, we can see some additional information here. We see that we already have 25 on order. So since we have a minimum stocking quantity of 61 and we have 11 available, and we already have 25 on order, the shortfall to get us back to our minimum stocking quantity is 25, and this is automatically calculated. Now over here we see who the preferred vendor is, the preferred vendor part number, and what the purchase price is. This is in the purchase unit of measure. And like all of the fields within AssetOptics, if you hover over the question mark, then you'll get a description of that particular field. Now you'll notice down here when we spoke earlier about the bin locations, we can see that we have 2 bin locations set up for this item. The primary bin 2A1B3 where we have 31 on hand, and then we have a secondary bin location of 1C2B3 here, and we have 4 on hand in that secondary bin location. Now let's do an inventory transaction right here. So we're going to click the New Part Transaction command button. And let's say that we're going to perform an issue of 1. So I'm going to select 1, and I'm going to select the work order that I'm going to issue it to. And we're just going to pick this work order right here, number 4052, and click Save. The transaction date defaulted to today. And then if we go to this particular work order, what we will see, we can scroll down and we can see the inventory transactions for this work order right here. So we had this inventory transaction for a quantity of 1. And we also see that we added in a part record right here, and a work order part record to indicate that we did not pre-plan this item. So we have a 0 planned quantity and a cumulative issue quantity of 1. So if we go back to this stock item, just to kind of recap, we see all of the stock item details here. We can see the bin locations. We can see the history of the inventory transactions. If we scroll down a little bit more, we could see the work order parts. So of course, from here we would be looking at what are all of the work orders that this part is associated with. Whereas if we were on a work order looking at the work order part records, we'd see all of the parts associated with that work order. Okay. Now you can also see what are all the PO lines that this particular part were associated with, and you may or may not have this on your page layout. Lastly, on a couple of items here, I'll point out that you can see what are all of the stock issue request lines that this part may be associated with, as well as you can see what's called asset part history. The first time that you issue a part to a work order for a specific asset, it makes a cross-reference to that asset. So I can go to a part and see what assets it had been issued to previously. Now, if we want to go up and we want to take a look at the enterprise-wide visibility, I would click on the product record, and this would take us up to the catalog, and we would see what are all of the service parts associated with this catalog. And I can see now that I store this in storeroom 1, storeroom 2, the storeroom called Maple, and another one, an abbreviation here for, I think, Saskatoon storeroom. We can see the on-hand quantity, what's our minimum stocking quantity, how many we have on order, and of course you can put anything on this particular related list. So just to recap, what we discussed was the basic object model around inventory management, as well as how to perform inventory transactions. Thank you.